Let's look at some alternatives to that flawed official poverty measure, which here I'm going to call the OPM, the official poverty measure. And we can start with the US Census Bureau itself, which has something that it calls the supplemental poverty measure, or the SPM. So the SPM improves upon two of the key kinds of problems with the OPM: the method by which that poverty threshold is set, and the means by which income and expenses are calculated. So on the first thing, on the threshold, it uses a much more sophisticated measure of living expenses, and it goes beyond just the cost of food. It includes food and shelter and clothing and utilities, and also does a much better job of adjusting for inflation than the OPM does. And also, the SPM offers a better method to calculate the resources that households have available to them. It better gauges both their income and their expenses. So on the income side, it builds upon the OPM and still counts all of the cash income the OPM does, but it also includes what are called near cash benefits, like SNAP, which we used to call food stamps, Section 8 housing vouchers, WIC, which is supplemental nutritional assistance to women and children, LIHEAP, which is a supplement to help people buy heat for their homes. It counts school lunches. All of that now is included in the income category. And it, also counts benefits that are received through the tax code. And this is especially important for the earned income tax credit and child tax credits, which can amount to an awful lot of money. And we'll talk about both of those down the road. Now, on the expense side, it counts the unavoidable costs of state and federal income taxes. The OPM doesn't include taxes. It counts payroll taxes, which the OPM doesn't do. And it includes the cost both of child care and out-of-pocket medical expenditures, or medical out-of-pocket expenditures, which is here as MOOP. So it offers a much more comprehensive sense of how households are really doing, how much money they really have available to meet their basic needs. So here's the result of these changes for 2016 and 2017. So first of all, take a look at what happens to the threshold. Because the new threshold tries to account for differences in the cost of living depending on your housing status, there are now separate thresholds, as you can see here. Notice that for renters, the threshold goes up by almost $2,000, and for owners with a mortgage by $2,000. Now, that may not seem like a big change, and many people still think it's too low, but $2,000 is a lot of money for a family making only $24,000 a year or so. So here's a bit of what that looks like geographically, with different poverty thresholds now for different places. And we're back to looking at 2018 data now. So the threshold goes up with the SPM. And here's what happens to the poverty rate with the new threshold and the new calculations of income and expenses. Poverty is higher under the SPM, but not by as much as many people thought it would be. It's about 1.5 percentage points for 2017. This is now looking at 2018 data. And 1.5 percentage points for 2017 and 1.3 for 2018. And that still represents millions of people now recognized as poor who were not counted as poor under the OPM. But poverty, according to the SPM, is not higher than the OPM everywhere, right? Going back to this notion that this varies in 1,000 different ways in 1,000 different places. And this is now looking at the difference between those two measures over time. But here's what I think is even more important about the SPM. So look at what happens to the poverty rate for particular age groups. Under the SPM, poverty among children is actually lower than we thought it was. Still very high by international standards, but not quite as bad as we thought. And look at what happens to the elderly poverty rate. It jumps. It goes higher than what it is under the OPM. Any guesses as to why? Well, this will help you answer that question. So now look down at the very bottom. That part of the chart shows things that increase poverty. The top half, the bars to the left, are things that decrease poverty. So even with Medicare, Medical expenditures can be very high for older Americans. The SPM now counts this, and that pushed their poverty rate up. By contrast, because the SPM also counts the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit as income, the poverty rate for children actually goes down. And this, by the way, is the importance of having good data. In a world in which politicians think resources are scarce, we can only solve the most urgent problems or allocate our resources effectively if we know the scale and scope of those problems, right? We stand a better chance of making good decisions if we're using SPM data rather than OPM data, because SPM data give us a better sense as to what's really going on in poor households. The SPM also allows us to just more generally see the effects of the welfare state of social assistance program. As this study shows, by 2012, no matter how inefficient some people may deem it to be, U.S. social policy reduces poverty by nearly half. So instead of 16%, the poverty rate would have been over 30%. Never let people tell you that anti-poverty programs are not effective. That's just wrong according to the data. That said, you can absolutely argue that they should be and could be more effective. But now, even with that better threshold, the SPM has the same problem the OPM does. It's a binary. It's got a sharp cutoff. While both measures tell us how many people have net incomes below the poverty line, they don't tell us how much below the lines people live. So now let's turn back for a moment just to the OPM here. Remember that 12.3% live below the official poverty line in 2017, which is what we're looking at here, about $25,000, $24,000, $25,000 for a family of four. The red line shows us people who were not just poor, but very poor, living below 50% of that poverty line, or about $12,500 gross for a family of four. It's almost half of the poverty population in the United States. They're not just poor, but they're very poor. And that's almost 6% of all Americans living on less than $12,500 for a family of four. As you should expect by now, this varies by race and by family type, among other things. We also have estimates of the number of Americans who are exceedingly poor, who are poor by international standards of abject poverty. And these are Americans who are living on less than $2 per day. Counting food stamps in their income, that's still something like 800,000 Americans. Now, I should note that there are other measures of this standard that show lower numbers than that, and you can see that here. It's another lesson in us being humble about poverty data and recognizing its limitations and just how hard it is to get an accurate count of these kinds of things. But just as knowing how many people live below the poverty threshold doesn't tell us how far below they are, so too does knowing how many people live above the threshold and are therefore technically not poor. Well, that doesn't tell us much about their well-being either, especially given how low that threshold is, right? So if you look at where that arrow is, that shows not people at 100% of the official poverty line, right? $24,000, $25,000 for a family of four, but the number of people who are living at twice the threshold, or about $50,000 for a family of four before taxes. As you can see, that's 30% of the population. This is a way to see similar data using the SPM for 2013. You might want to pause that and sort of poke around, see if you can make sense of that chart. So, apart from all of the things that the Census Bureau does, there are other kinds of attempts to calculate the amount of money needed to get by in the United States. Here are two of the dozens and dozens and dozens of alternative budgets, which recognizes that the cost of housing especially differs from place to place. But every one of these that I have ever examined shows costs well above either the OPM or the SPM thresholds, sometimes 2 or 3 times as high, which may be another way of saying that the U.S. poverty measure is itself a measure of deep poverty rather than ordinary poverty. There's another problem with the poverty measures we've looked at so far, and that is that they are point-in-time measures. They tell us how many people were poor during the time of the survey, which is how these data are gathered, very, very sophisticated surveys. But imagine this scenario. You had a family of 4 and make $52,000 a year. You work from January through June, and you earn $26,000 gross income. But then you're fired, and you earn nothing at all from July through December. Well, your income for the year was $26,000, right? Which puts you above the threshold. So according to the census data, you were not poor, even though your family had no income coming in at all for half of the year. This is a problem. Well, the Census Bureau knows about this problem, right? And they provide us other data that allow us to ask not how many people were poor over the period of the annual survey, but to step back a bit and look at a 3-year period and ask how many people were poor for at least 2 months at any time in that period. What we find when we look at what are called poverty spells in this way is that the poverty rate was not the 15% reflected in the official rate for these years, but actually more than twice that, 35%. Poverty is much more common in the United States than official measures suggest. But we learned another important thing from that approach. So look here, this shows us not how many people were poor at least once for 2 months or more over that 3-year period, but how many people were poor for the entire time. Notice how small that number is. Long-term persistent poverty that lasts year after year and maybe even decade after decade, that's real, but it's a tiny portion of the problem. Our attention, I think, is all out of proportion, and we don't pay nearly enough attention to this kind of epiphenomenal poverty that about 1/3 of Americans experience over a 3-year period, right? That's slipping in and out of poverty for large numbers of people. So we looked a few moments ago at the experience of poverty over a 4-year period. We can step back even further and look at the experience of poverty over the entire lifespan. So over the course of their entire adult lives, almost 2/3 of Americans will be among the bottom 20% of income earners, and 40% will be among the bottom 10% of income earners. This is from the same researchers. So, and before we move on to causes down the road, I want to return very briefly to variation by race. This should look familiar by now. Take a look at that. Right, we've already seen that. Almost 35% of the U.S. population has a spell of poverty, right, is poor for 2 months or more over that 4-year period. That number is 50% for African Americans who are poor at least once for 2 months or more over a 4-year period. 53% for Hispanic Americans.